Your brain is producing emotions right now: fear, loneliness, shame, tenderness, the full range. The question isn't whether men feel them, the question is what happens next, and that's where things get interesting. Welcome to the Quiet Midlife. I'm Jerry Kennard, retired psychologist, and someone who's spent a career thinking about how men's minds work. In this episode, I'll be talking about emotions, specifically why men feel just as much as anyone else, why so little of it tends to reach the surface, and what the research tells us about the cost of that gap. By the end, you'll understand the difference between having emotions, being able to name them, why silence isn't stoicism, and what's actually going on beneath the surface of the men around you, and possibly yourself. So, let's get into it. Let's start with something that shouldn't be controversial, but somehow still is. Men actually have emotions, and by emotions, I'm talking here about the full range: grief, fear, loneliness, shame, tenderness, love, all of it. The idea that men are somehow less emotional than women isn't supported by the evidence. What the evidence does suggest, and this is important, is that men and women often differ in how they express emotions and how they interpret them, and what happens when those emotions aren't acknowledged. That last part, what happens when emotions aren't acknowledged, is where most of the problems start. The belief that men are somehow less emotional has been around a long time, and many men have absorbed it as a fact about themselves. You ask the average man how he's feeling, and he'll give you something like a status report. He's fine, tired, busy, rather than anything that actually resembles an emotional account. Now, this isn't dishonesty. For many men, the question genuinely doesn't compute in the way it might for someone else. They haven't been given the language, the vocabulary, or in some cases the permission. Here's the thing about emotions that don't get named. They don't disappear. They don't go somewhere else. Pushing feelings down doesn't reduce their physiological impact. In fact, it often intensifies it. The body responds to unexpressed emotional stress in a very physical way. Elevated cortisol, that's the stress hormone, disrupted sleep, increased blood pressure. Men who routinely suppress emotional experience aren't protecting themselves from it, they're just paying the bill later, often with interest. Now, there's a term worth knowing here. It's called alexithymia. It's from the Greek, literally, without words for feelings. Alexithymia is much more common in men than women, and it describes a genuine difficulty in identifying and describing your own emotional states. Not necessarily a refusal to engage. It's not stubbornness. It's a genuine skill deficit, and it's often rooted in early experience, which can be addressed. I'll cover alexithymia in a separate episode, but for now the point is this. Some men don't name their emotions because they've chosen not to, and some men don't name them because they genuinely don't know what they are. Both are worth understanding, and neither is a character flaw. So the question is, why does it happen? Why are men less likely to identify and express their emotional lives? Well, number of answers. One is its biology. Part of it's something we did to ourselves as a culture. From an early age, boys, as you probably recognise, receive a consistent message about emotional expression. Crying shows weakness. Showing vulnerability invites ridicule. You need toughness, stoicism, self-reliance. These are framed not really as preferences so much as defining characteristics of what a man's supposed to be. And by the time most men reach adulthood, The suppression of the emotional expression has become so habitual, it barely registers as suppression at all. It just feels like that's what it's like to be a man. Think about that for a moment. A restriction that was installed without your agreement or permission, and that's shaped entirely how you relate to your own inner life, and that you've probably never examined. Surely that's worth examining. Not all emotions are equally difficult for men to acknowledge. If we take, for example, anger is an emotion, and it tends to be pretty relatively accessible. It's even culturally permissible. In some cases, it's even expected. Fear, sadness, shame, loneliness, no, those are expressions that are considerably harder. These are the emotions most closely associated with vulnerability, and vulnerability, for most men who grew up with a standard script, is the quality they were most strongly discouraged from showing. I'd argue that the emotions that most need expression are the ones signalling distress, loss, the need for some kind of connection. These are the ones that are much more likely to be suppressed. And the one emotion that tends to be expressed freely, anger, is often a secondary emotion. It sits on something much more vulnerable. The man who responds to grief with irritability isn't being dishonest. He may simply lack another route to what he's actually experiencing. In clinical work, it's seen quite regularly. A man comes in angry. Beneath the anger we find sadness, fear, shame, but he just hasn't developed the vocabulary by which to express such things. Clinicians working with men frequently observe what might be called as emotional masking. It's the presentation of one emotion in the place of another. So we get anger instead of grief. We find humour instead of fear. We find apparent indifference instead of pain. And a man who responds to a serious medical diagnosis, say with jokes, isn't necessarily coping well. He may be doing the only thing he knows how to do in the face of fear. Then, of course, there's shame. Now, shame deserves particular attention because it's quite common in men, and it's particularly corrosive. Now, there's a researcher, Brené Brown, who found that while women often experience shame around, say, appearance and relationships, men typically tend to experience it most acutely around perceived weaknesses, failures, or some kind of inadequacy. So in a culture that equates masculinity with competence and self-sufficiency, the experience of struggling with mental health, relationships, with life in general, it can trigger profound shame. And that's partly why men are much less likely to seek help. They're less likely to disclose distress, and they're much more likely to reach a crisis point before anyone around them realizes that something's wrong. Shame makes silence feel safer than disclosure, even when the silence is actively harmful. So the relationship between emotional life and physical health is pretty well established, and it's consistently underrated by men. Chronic stress, unexpressed grief, persistent loneliness, unmanaged anxiety, all of these have documented effects on immune function, cardiovascular health, sleep problems, metabolic regulation. Men over 40 are at a stage where this relationship becomes increasingly hard to ignore, and emotional patterns established over decades begin to show up in ways that can no longer be attributed to a bad week or just getting older. I'm not intending any of this to be alarming, but I am intending it to be honest. The connection between emotional life and physical well-being isn't a soft topic. It's a serious one, and the evidence for it is pretty robust. Now, what does emotional awareness actually look like in practice, you might be wondering? Well, I want to be clear about this because there's a version of emotional awareness that involves, say, spending your evenings in lengthy discussions about your feelings. That's not what I'm describing. Emotional awareness means developing enough familiarity with your own emotional states to notice them, name them, and, where necessary, do something constructive with them. It's a practice skill, not a therapeutic project. And for many men, the most accessible entry point isn't through the mind at all. It's actually through the body. Emotions register physically before they're consciously identified. We feel the tension in the shoulders, the tightness in the chest. We get disrupted appetites or bad night's sleep. Learning to read these physical signals as some kind of emotional information, rather than just say physical inconveniences, is often much more accessible for men. It's better than the direct route of asking, "How am I feeling?" So you start there. What's happening in your body right now? That's the question that opens the door. Now here's the part of the conversation I want to end on. The research on emotional skills in men is actually broadly optimistic. Unlike personality traits, which are pretty well relatively stable, emotional awareness and expression all respond to intervention, to experience, and to some form of conscious attention. Men who begin paying closer attention to their emotional life typically find that the skills develop much faster than they expected. The capacity was there all along, it just hadn't been given much exercise. So I guess that's my message. You're not broken, you're simply that there's a dimension to your own inner life that you haven't really been introduced to properly. Introducing yourself to it tends to produce better decisions, better relationships, and much better health outcomes than the alternative. And the alternative, of course, has costs attached to it. If anything in this episode has resonated, if you recognize the patterns we've been talking about in yourself, perhaps in someone you care about, then you could pop along to my website, drjerrykennard.com, and look at the resources for men which are available for both the UK and the US. That website covers all of the territory I've talked about in greater depth, where I look at mental health, relationships, work, aging, various practical tools that really work. Everything there is free to read, there's no ads and there's no pop-ups. Anyway, next episode, I'll be looking at something that affects a significant number of men and almost nobody talks about honestly. Until then, I'll keep you guessing, but take care of yourself, and if you're like me, watch your back. I'm Jerry Kennard. This is The Quiet Midlife.